Hey everybody, we are going to talk about Photoshop and Illustrator implementation into Adobe After Effects today. So how can we get a completely layered Photoshop file into our After Effects software? Well, you're going to learn that today. So I have two examples we're going to play with. We're going to play with this kind of fake advertisement for an iPhone, and then we're going to use this kind of logo, cartoon logo in Illustrator to talk about the differences and similarities of being able to pull a logo into another. So as you can see, we'll start with the Photoshop file. I have named layers. I have, in this case, a drop shadow effect. And then I have a couple of just kind of shadow layers and things like that. The one graphic layer is set to screen. That's going to be important to kind of keep note of. And I went ahead and saved this as a PNG. It's important as we start that we understand that for motion graphics, mostly our images should be 72 dpi. So you can see this image actually falls a little bit short of that 1920 by 1080 that we've been dealing with. But you want to avoid having like 500 dpi or resolution, mainly because this is for a screen. So a good way around that is when you're creating your files and you go to File New, give it a second here to load, simply go to the Film and Video option and choose the HD TV 1080. So this is a really good starting point for everyone that they can kind of create their very own implementation to After Effects that will smoothly transfer over. All right, so I have this saved off on my desktop. So I'm going to simply hop over to After Effects and double click in my project window. And I'm going to highlight, not double click, but just highlight the smartphone PSD. Now, by default, it says import as footage, and that would be great, but that would essentially flatten my Photoshop file. So instead, I'd like to import as a composition, which we now know is a folder essentially, and I want to retain the sizes of every single object in every single folder. So I'm going to use composition retain layer styles. I'm going to go ahead and hit import. The next question it asks me is, do you want to maintain those layer styles within your Photoshop file into After Effects? Now, what they mean by layer styles in this case are things such as the drop shadow for the text, if I had a stroke, or if I had a glow or any other layer style effect on my layer. And in this case, yeah, I'll keep them on there. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And what that's going to do is build in a couple of different things. It's going to give me a composition named smartphone, and it's going to give me all my different layers on individual asset layers. Now, just so you know, as we know, After Effects does reference back to that original file. So if you go changing the PSD or you move the PSD from one folder to another, it is going to either update or lose some of these layers. So to get into our composition, I'm going to just double click, and I'm going to set my views back to one view, scroll in, and you can see now I have my nice text. Now, what exactly do we have? Well, we have the text. It looks like it's rasterized the text for us. Okay, that's something we'll have to play with. We have the graphic itself, so if we want to change that, we can. We have the object, and you can see underneath that the object shadow and then the background. So we have a lot of ability to play with these. So let's just start with the text. I'm going to go ahead and solo that layer, and I'm going to undo my background so you can see this a little better. And for this layer, like I said, in the conversion, it rasterized our text. But don't fret. What we can actually do is play with that layer a little bit by going to Layer, and we can go to Create. Now, if you're using a Photoshop file, this is a really good trick. You can actually convert that back into editable text. That means I can go and change it. So if the iPhone changed its name from the iPhone Z to the iPhone X, one simple click of that button, you can see it's now text. I can get my text tool, and I can simply make that an X and unsolo my layer, and my updates are complete. And it retains everything. You'll see it still, if I drop down my menu, it retains the drop shadow. So if you're not too happy with the color, maybe we want to make our drop shadow a little bit of a darker blue instead of a black to kind of blend it in more, we can go ahead and do that. We can also change the opacity. We can change the angle of the drop shadow, the distance, the spread, and so forth. So you can see, I don't know why we want to go that far up, but if you wanted to, you can go and do that. So that's a really cool function. And all of these now have different ways to kind of play around with them. So if I wanted to group these back together, I could simply highlight the three objects, the phone, the screen, and then the shadow. And I could just simply right click and go to pre-compose. And I can call this phone. And this is great because what that will do, as you all know, is will give me a composition just with the phone in it. And I can kind of play around. Now, building this further in this composition, we have a lot of wasted space now. If you want to crop your composition, you can do a few things. I like to use the region of interest tool, which is just really like odd looking button right next to our toggle transparency. And what I like to do is just highlight. In this case, I'm going to highlight over my phone. And I'm going to go to my composition settings at the top here, and I'm going to say trim comp to region of interest. And what that's going to do is it's going to actually help me out here. It gave me a little shifting, but I can move it back into place because now I have better control. I don't have this giant box that I'm animating. I can actually, move my anchor point. I can hit my Y key if we want, in this case, maybe to move the anchor point to the bottom. And rotate that phone in, or maybe have a couple different phones fan out, which is something you see quite often in these commercials these days. So we can kind of animate all that good stuff as we go. But this is basically it. This is a way to really control your layers. And so again, if maybe I don't want this and I want to add a new solid behind there instead, I can go ahead and adjust that. I can still utilize my file. I can toggle switch my modes. I could play around with screens to try to bring in some of that lighting effect. Multiply if I wanted to pull in just mixing the colors slightly. I have a lot of different options in here. I can do a little overlay right there to kind of pull in both and really set up my scene for success. So that's how you would do a Photoshop file. An Illustrator file is this is very similar, but now in Photoshop, as you can see, these came in as objects. But let's see, before we hop into Illustrator real quick, let's see what would happen if we put something in a folder. So I'm going to put the graphic, the phone, and the shadow, and I'm going to actually call this phone. And what I'm going to do is actually clear my library here. Highlight all those, move them to the trash can. Yeah, sure, I want to delete. Double click, and what I'm going to do is actually save this. So I have now a folder. And we know folders are compositions. So if we go through the process again and import our files, composition retain layer sizes, that looks good. And we double click, you'll now see that phone layer is in its own thing. Now it didn't do the cool, region of interest trick that we did, but that's okay. That takes just a few kind of simple seconds to do. And just to kind of nudge back over here, we can do that. Again, go back into layer, but you can see folders actually come in as compositions within our advertisement here. So just kind of a neat way to kind of play around with your layers. Now, if I'm going to import an Illustrator file, let's go over to this Toontown logo. Right now, I have a couple of different options. I have a background, which is just a essentially empty layer. So let's go ahead and in this layer, make sure we draw an actual object, and let's not make it white. Let's just make it kind of a gray, just so that pops. And we have our two words within this sublayer. Now, as we know, Illustrator doesn't really use folders. They use sublayers, layers and sublayers. So we're going to just start with those two layers, and we're going to go to Save As. I'm going to put Toontown logo. We're going to go ahead and hit Save. Sure, we'll replace it. Everything looks good by default. Go over in After Effects, highlight that, import as, same way, composition retain layer sizes, hit import. And what it does is the same exact thing. It will pull in the different layers. Now here's the kicker. As you can see, I can't really edit this text anymore. So that's the one downside. But the positive side is I have vector text. So I can go ahead and turn on this little starburst. And what's really cool about that is now, if I'm playing with the layer, I can actually scale this up as big as I want. Notice the crispness And so, in this case, we don't have to worry about dots per inch or anything like that because our logo kind of works. Now, let's say we wanted tune and town to be on two separate layers. Well, let's go ahead and delete this. And let's go back to our After Effects file. There we go. And I'm going to just simply, let's take the word tune, and I'm going to highlight it, and then we're going to go to the little drop down here at the top, and I'm going to say release two layers. And let's see if I can get this to work. I'll do a new layer and then drop it in it. There we go. All right, so now I have my layers. So I have tune, I have town, and then I have my background. So I'm going to hit a quick save, Control S, save it out there. And I'm going to go back in and run through the same process again. Really easy methods here. So I'm going to make sure it's set to composition. I'm going to make sure that it's set to the layer size, hit OK. And now you'll notice I have tune and town on separate layers. So now I can really get like that animation going, or if I want like a really fun scaling effect, like it pops in. I can turn on my vector backgrounds if I need to. I can do all sorts of different things. So having these little vector elements is really great. I can even make these 3D layers and really play around with that. So that's the basics of working with Photoshop and Illustrator files in After Effects. A lot of the times what I'll do is actually build most of my comps without motion, obviously, in one of these two programs and then import them in later on. And that's kind of that work smarter, not harder logo, composition mentality. And I highly suggest that for a lot of your backgrounds as well, because then you can always piece them together and kind of work with them. And again, they're all editable. At any point, if you wanted to collect these files, which I always recommend, you would go to Dependencies, Collect Files. We would save our project. We'll just throw this in P1, sure. And then it will collect all the files for you. So if you're afraid that you've kind of lost touch for them or you can't find them, it's going to go ahead and pull in all those different layers and the different Photoshop and Illustrator files. So that's the basics of combining and having all these programs talk to one another. I'm really looking forward into seeing how you use this and how you elevate your animations by starting to create complex backgrounds using tools you already know and putting them into a new tool like Adobe After Effects. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.